Boker Tov.
Tzaharaim tovim, Matt Weiss.
Good to see everybody this morning. Thank you for joining us. Friends, we are in for another session of Rabbi Matt Berkowitz's weekly Parsha class. We are so glad that you've joined us today. Again, we'll keep the format the way we've done in the past, pretty informal. Raise your hand either on the screen or through the chat if you have a comment or question. We're looking forward to the next hour. Rabbi Berkowitz.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And Tzaharaim tovim, good afternoon from Israel. Welcome back. Boker Tov to all of you in North America. Really wonderful to see you. Glad you are taking a break from frying your latkes and making your sufganiot, making your donuts, to be able to join us for some Torah. So wonderful to be here. I feel like we literally are minutes away from Hadlakat Neirot, from candlelighting here in Israel. If I could, I'd have you go back in the car with me and light candles. But we'll save that for when you could do it in person. I want to say as we begin that I want to dedicate our learning this morning to a very, very special student, a very, very dear friend to the Jewish Theological Seminary and Camps Ramah, and that is Ab Flat, Zichrono Livracha. Ab Flat was very, very near and dear to my heart. And indeed, his wife, Phyllis Flat, is an active member of this Parsha class. And Phyllis will be back with us. She saw her yesterday at a Zoom Shiva visit, and she will be back with us next week. He was an absolutely remarkable human being from Toronto, wintering in Boca Raton in Boca West. And Ab's claim to fame is he cared passionately about Jewish camping, was very, very active in the Foundation for Jewish Camping. And on top of that, it was his family, the Flat Wolf family, that were the founders of Ramah, Canada, just north of Toronto. And that was his life's work. And when they were in Florida, they were very, very active learners. With JTS, Phyllis continues to be a remarkably active learner. And the Jewish world, and I would say the world entire, has really lost one of its Lamed Vavniks, one of its 36 righteous people. That's how wonderful a neshama, wonderful a soul Ab was. So I want to dedicate our learning this morning to Ab, a way of bringing a light into the darkness of his morning. So here we are, Parashat Vayeshev, and this is a very, very action-filled parsha. Why do I say that it's an action-filled parsha? It's to jump in. What is Parashat Vayeshev famous or infamous for? Come on, this is where all the great action begins. Riva, I see you're trying to speak. Just take yourself off mute.
Yeah, isn't this the parsha where Jacob he meets back with Esau, as we talked about last week, and then he's okay, and then they go to dwell in different lands, and then it's the story of Joseph.
Very good, excellent. Okay, good. You got to the point that I wanted to make. This is the beginning of the story of Joseph, right? And essentially from this chapter, the 37th chapter of Genesis, straight to the end of the book, we deal with the intrigues of the Joseph story. And in addition to that, this is what brings us to the chapter of the descent of the Israelites into the land of Egypt. Okay, so this is a very, very liminal moment for a people, very important moment. And Riva, I'm also very, very glad that you began with Jacob, okay, because Jacob is where I want to start off, where I want to focus at the beginning of the shiur. And indeed, there are so many rich aspects of Parashat Vayeshev. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look essentially at 4 characters. Okay, our focus at the beginning is going to be intensely on Yaakov, on Jacob. Then we'll turn to Yosef, Joseph, the favored son, Reuven, and then the most important actor, who we do not experience explicitly in the story at this point, and that is God. So we're going to tease out a number of themes, and most importantly, we're going to look at the notable silence of God, especially at the beginning of the Parsha, and see how it is that commentators weave God into the Parsha for us, right? Even though God is not explicitly there, right? We know well that implicitly God is there. We feel God's presence in a strong way, God sort of moving the pieces behind the story. In that respect, this story is very, very similar to one found in the writing section of Torah. What story am I referring to? That we read in the spring, very important story. Shelley?
Esther?
Excellent, Esther. Okay, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of literary similarities between the Joseph story and the Esther story. It's actually great homework for you to do after our class, to sit down, read both texts, and see the points of comparison, right? They're quite striking. So, especially in the respect that in the story of Esther, right, the most important character is entirely missing from that story. At least we have some mention of God in the Joseph narrative, right? But in Esther, not a single mention of God. And that's actually why scribes, when they begin the art of learning how to write, they always start with the book of Esther, right? Because they don't have to worry about all the complicated halachot related to writing God's name. So God is entirely absent in that story, and you're going to see how striking it is that God is absent in the very first section of the Joseph narrative. So let's turn to the source sheet that I sent out. I'm going to pull it up as we share screen. Just give me one moment here. Okay, do you all see Parashat Vayeshev on finding maturity, responsibility, and God in exile? Just shake your head so I know that you see it. Great, okay. So I want to start with the very, very first line of this Parsha, and that is, and Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. Okay, so part of
Matt,
what is
I
so
don't
very...
see it. Matt, I don't see what on my screen.
I think you just need to adjust it on the screen, Matt, because we can't quite see the whole thing. Just
Okay, so let me try again. One moment.
okay, thanks.
Thank you for telling me, Diane. Can you see it now?
Not yet, no. I think you need to
Not
share
yet?
screen again.
That's strange. Okay. That's really weird. Hold on.
You clearly learned a lot at the seminary, but not how to share screens.
Oh, usually I'm pretty good at this. Let's try it again.
There's a green button at the bottom of the screen.
How's that?
Got it.
There you go.
can see-
All right.
Okay, you
A little
see it
blurry.
now?
Make it
a little-
bigger. The print is too small.
Okay. Okay, ready? How's that?
Good.
Great. Okay. So we're at the very, very opening of the Parsha where it says, and Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. Okay. Part of what is so significant that Rashi, the great medieval commentator, latches onto here is this notion of Jacob being settled. Okay. He's ready for a bit of peace at this point in his life. We know that up until this point, Jacob's life has been anything but a bracha. It's been anything but a bowl of cherries. He's had his share of challenges. What are some of the challenges that Jacob has had in his life? Who would like to chime in here?
I will. I mean, he went to take a wife and he worked 20 years basically and ended up with 2. But he was basically a servant for all those years.
Right, good, Riva. Okay, so there's the servitude. Okay, before that, there's all the tension with his brother Esav. Tension abates somewhat. Okay,
and his parents, a father who really favored the other son more than him, and the mother who favored him. The whole dysfunction of moms and dads.
Excellent. The dysfunction of parental favoritism. Never do this with your own children, Toby.
And he had to flee for his life. That's a pretty bad thing.
There are all the problems that he had with his children. The attack on Dina, his son's
Excellent.
etc.
Good. The attack on Dina, the misery with Reuven and Shimon, right there. They're taking vengeance on the inhabitants of Shechem. So you see the bracha or birthright that he has, right, has really not come to fruition yet. He's had a long and difficult life. So now we come to chapter 37. Torah tells us that he is ready to be settled. And Rashi latches onto this in a very, very powerful way. He looks at that and says, wait a moment, not so quickly, okay? Jacob wants to, are we frozen? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, Matt, it might have been on your end.
Hello?
Here, you're back.
You froze for a minute, but you're okay now.
Okay, great. Okay, so Jacob is ready for his retirement, right? He is ready to head down to South Florida and into a gated community, right? Play a little golf, right? But this is not meant to be at this point. Okay, let's go back to the source sheets. I want to show you 3 different takes on the opening of the Parsha. Okay, so we're going to Rashi source number 2. And Rashi says the following: Jacob wished to live at ease, but this trouble in connection with Joseph suddenly came upon him. When the righteous wish to live at ease, the Holy One says to them, are not the righteous satisfied with what is stored up for them in the world to come, that they wish to live at ease in this world too? Bikesh Yaakov leshev b'shalva, kafatz alav rogzo shel Yosef. Tzadikim mevakshim leshev b'shalva, omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lo dayan letzadikim ma shemitukan lahem leolam haba, ele shemevakshim leshev b'shalva be'olam hazeh. So in this reading of Rashi, who is at fault for the misery that comes upon Jacob? Who would we want to blame? Who brings the turbulence upon Jacob? Right? It's God. Okay? Obviously, we could put the blame at Jacob's own feet because he has this desire for peace at this point in his life, right? And God takes note of this, right? And in a way, when we think about it, Jacob is not meant for this very, very calm existence. Jacob's alter ego, remember, is Yisrael. He's the one who is meant to wrestle, right? Yes, he wants to live in peace, but perhaps this is also expressing that there's a sense of entitlement that he has to do so, to sit down and live in peace. And God is not going to let that happen at this point in his life. For good and for bad, there are lessons to be learned, there are journeys to go on, and there are adventures to be had. Now let's take a look at the next midrashic source, okay, which gives us a very different view, and that is Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, source number 3. when the righteous settle in peace and seek to settle in peace in this world, Satan comes to accuse them. Amar Rabbi Acha b'sha'a she'atzadikim yoshvim b'shalva u'mivakshim leshev b'shalva be'olam hazeh hasatan ba u'mikatareg. Okay, so here we have a different source of tribulation. It's not God who's doing it, right? But rather it's Satan.
Nancy has a question. Yeah.
It was really more of an observation, but thank you, Carolyn. And as we read the next one, it's the same. So when God does something good, it's God. And when something bad happens, oh, Satan is now coming to do it, you know, the little devil on my shoulder. But what occurred to me was, you know, you're saying, you know, Jacob wanted to live in peace, but he was apparently meant to struggle. And that's a real Eastern philosophical kind of a Buddhist concept of life is all about struggle. And that we really only grow from our struggles. We don't grow as human beings when we're just at peace and everything falls into place. Or the corollary of you learn the most from your mistakes. And when you had talked about just being at ease and that maybe Jacob wasn't meant to be at ease, that just clicked in my head about, you know, the Eastern philosophy of life is really about the struggle. And that's kind of
Nancy, you're reminding me again of this wonderful lecture that I listened to by Amos Oz that was given at the Weizmann Institute in 2013. And part of what Amos Oz says is that he never wrote about happy people. He never wrote about content, calm people. He always wrote about people with tsuris, right? Because people with tsuris are far more interesting, right? Their lives are textured in a way that, you know, which is, I think a very, very interesting, commentary. It's one of the reasons that I find Israel to be such an animated place, such, it's a place with such wonderful, wonderful energy. It seems like everybody's got a story. There's plenty of tribulation here, right? But there's so much richness in the texture of the people. So I think that connects well to what you just said. Shelley?
I don't know a lot about Eastern stuff, but I do know about Eastern Europe and the idea of never all the superstition where you don't, God forbid, admit that things are going well because
Right.
it will
Yes.
it will hear you. Someone's going to end up hearing you, and all of that. It's like as if we can't live in peace. It's impossible. And
Right,
as far as one more thing,
It has
and
the
as far
potential.
as anyone who lives like a happy life, I've read a lot of Amos Oz's novels, and let's face it, I mean, most people's lives are truly filled with tsuris. People who walk around and say, oh, everything's great in my life, I'm very suspicious of them. Like, how is it possible that everything could be great? I mean, am I wrong?
No, you're right. You're right. Yes, you're right on target. Steve.
Steve.
The issues here for me is, I agree with what Nancy said and what Shelley said, what you said. I think what the issue here is whether God is sitting up there with a paddle and saying, I'm going to make this thing, or whether it's just part of life. Some people, have more serenity and peace in their lives and other people don't, but just because you want it doesn't mean you're going to get it. Right. And I'm thinking with Shelley also specifically, sometimes when I go to some funerals and the rabbi says, and so and so and so and so, they walked together, for X number of years together. They were never separated. I keep wondering, I mean, I have a great marriage, but it's not perfect. I keep wondering, do they get an aliyah? And I know also, the last thing I was saying, I know, and Chabad does not give eulogies at funerals. I don't know if you knew that. They do not give eulogies, and partly because there's a tendency to want to elevate someone higher than what they actually lived, and that's not you're not supposed to do that. So, but everyone has a different set of cards, and we don't know what they are.
Right. Look, like you, Steve, I don't want to believe in a God that's micromanaging our lives. On so many levels, I really reject that in my own theology. I often go back to something that I learned with my very dear teacher, Rabbi Bill Lebo, when I was a senior in the rabbinical school. And Rabbi Lebo once said to us that there are two very, very powerful moments in which God enters our life, right? That is when we're born and when we die, right? And everything in between is a partnership between us and God, right? Mostly, right, it's on our shoulders, right? How it is that we act as a covenantal partner. And that's always spoken to me in a very, very deep way. I think our buddy, Dr. Joel Politzer would also confirm this as well, that, when a child is born, you've got that experience of, the breath of life coming into them, right? And then, when you think of the bookends, when the soul leaves the body, right? There's that very, very powerful moment in which you sense that there's this separation, this divine touch, as it were. So like you, Steve, I don't want to believe that God is micromanaging. When I look at Rashi's commentary, I feel that the power of the commentary is bringing God into a place where God isn't literally in the story. That's what makes me appreciate what Rashi is doing here. That he has the ability to bring God in where God clearly isn't. And the same goes for, I think I prefer Rashi to, Genesis Rabbah here. I'd rather have God there than Satan. And the Satan piece, I'm sure, reminds many of you of the story of Job. Right? This is exactly what happens, right? Satan takes notice of how good Job's life is and runs to God and says, you think this is, a believer, you think this is a faithful guy, send him a little trouble and see what happens. Let's see to what extent he believes in you. Joel, did you want to say something?
Well, first of all, thank you for the attribution. No, but I agree completely that one of the things that we as a society, whether it's Jewish society or society as a whole, has lost is that we are no longer present at the instant and at the moment of natural death. And therefore, we have lost the ability to actually see what happens at that instant. And I know I think I can say this to this crowd. I know I can't say it to the medical students because they have no idea what I'm talking. People in their mid-20s have no idea who Shirley MacLaine is. But when I say, I'm not channeling Shirley MacLaine, you literally see something going. And it's an energy, we, call it the neshama, call it the life force, chi, pneumo, whatever. Every society has a name for it. Therefore, every society has seen it. And you're absolutely correct. The God gives us something, and at X number of years later, whatever it is goes back. And we no longer see that. And I think that has distorted our view of a lot of things.
Right. I'm sure. And all the more so now, in what we're living through, that we simply can't be physically, even if we wanted to be physically present at that moment, we can't be physically present at that moment. And it's a heartbreak, it's emotionally, psychologically, on every level. So again, thank you, Joel.
And Linda has a comment. Oh, we have to unmute you, Linda. There you go.
So, Rabbi, reading that passage, it reminds me of the phrase, "An idle mind is the devil's playground." Did that come from this, or was that just?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it came from our wisdom literature, if it came from what it is that we experience as we read Eov, right? Clearly, don't think of Satan, in our culture, in Western culture, we think of Satan as the devil, right? Here in Jewish tradition, in the Bible, rabbinic tradition, Satan is understood as being the adversary of God, being an adversarial divine being, adversarial angel, as it were. Okay, somebody who pokes, somebody who prods, but certainly not this image of the devil. So I think that too is important to keep in mind. Let's take a look at the next source, Torah Shlema, okay, which is at the bottom of the first page. I'm going to pull it up again. And Jacob was settled. Jacob conjectured. God said to Abraham that his children would be sojourners. I have been a sojourner for 20 years in the house of Laban, enslaved to tending his sheep. And when he saw that Esau had gone to live in another city, he said, with this, the 400 years of slavery is fulfilled. And his mind was settled. But God said, my thoughts are deeper than yours. As it is said, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. And immediately brought upon him the plot of Joseph. When did God bring this plot on him? When he thought there would be no slavery in Egypt, and his mind became settled. Now Jacob was settled. Okay, so what is this particular midrash referring to? If we were to go back all the way to the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, there Abraham or Avram is given a prophecy by God. And God says to him, this is in the midst of what is known as the Brit Ben Habitarim, the covenant of the parts. God says to Avram, know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, but I will execute judgment on the nation they will serve, and in the end, they will go free with great wealth. So what's happening here? How are we to understand this? How do we understand that midrash and its connection to
foreshadowing? It's foreshadowing.
Good. What is it foreshadowing, Shelley?
The bondage in Egypt, the slavery.
Okay, very good. The traditional understanding of Genesis 15 is that is the prophecy that Avram receives regarding the enslavement of the Israelites in the land of Egypt, right? It fits perfectly. We're in Egypt for 400 years, 430 years, if we do the math precisely, right? It all fits, right? And we leave Egypt with great wealth. It's exactly what Avram was told. However, according to the midrash that we just read, Torah Shlema, Jacob understood that prophecy to refer to his life, right? That it wasn't Egypt that was being spoken of, but rather it was Jacob being enslaved, right, to, a strange nation. That strange nation, the Canaanite nation or the Canaanite nations that existed in the land, okay? And Jacob refers to himself as a foreigner, and that's part of what's so striking about that opening verse. It says that Jacob was settled in the land where his father sojourned. Okay, we've got this internal contradiction in that verse, right? He wants to be settled, but it's the place, Be'eretz Migurei Aviv. It's the place where his ancestors, where his father specifically, is a stranger. That's conveying to us the quality of humility and how it is that Jacob understood his presence in the land of Israel, or let's say how Torah understands Jacob's presence in the land of Israel. Jacob is not permanently settled in Israel, right? And I want to say, it's important even today for us to have that conception that we are not permanently settled here. We cannot take our existence in the land of Israel for granted, right? Being here is a gift. There's a sense of temporality to what it is to be in the land. And that is the life that Jacob has chosen here. Diane?
So I'm wondering, because I've always thought about this, that there was a famine eventually. And, you know, his kids are growing up. He doesn't say anything to get food for what's happening in the land. Is he still settled in his mind that this is where everything's going to be? Because eventually, you know, it's finally, you know, he sends somebody down to Egypt to see what's happening. But in his mind, from what I understand, his children were all grown up. It wasn't like he had babies on his hands or anything like that. Nobody talked about going and getting and seeing what was happening. So is that a settling in his mind that he just couldn't get around what was actually happening for so many years?
Right. It's great. You're pushing us to go deeper into Jacob's personality here.
Yes.
And when we think of the kind of person Jacob is a very, very passive person. Jacob comes off as being, you know, a material person. Jacob, in many ways, is a self-centered person. According to the Midrash that we know, right, for a person to read the prophecy given to Avram as pertaining to their life, right, there's, you know, you got to have a healthy ego to do that. You know, this is all about me. And I believe that, you know, if that's the mirror that we're given of Jacob here, it helps us to make sense of his son Joseph, right? When we look at Joseph, he's a very, very similar type of character. Okay, although less passivity, but he's extremely self-centered. Now Jacob ends up getting pushed to the point where ultimately he turns around and says to his sons, "Stop looking at each other, go down and procure food. You know, we're starving here," right? So ultimately, he's forced to do that. But again, just like, you know, earlier, it's these external forces that act on him. He's not a person that is proactive. He's not a person that takes initiative like we would expect him to. Toby?
Well, I think that if we look back at Jacob's history, there are times that he was proactive, particularly in his dealings with Laban. I mean, he, you know, with the flocks and, you know, making sure that he left with all of those, that was definitely proactive. And so he's sort of, in some senses, he's passive, and in some senses, he is active and takes initiative. And in terms of going down to Egypt, I know we're getting ahead, but when we think about our own day, what it takes for somebody to pick up and go, it takes an awful lot. And it's really not so surprising that he didn't do it earlier, because it was, if it's dangerous today, it was even more dangerous then. And they didn't really know what would happen, what the situation would be in Egypt, even if they heard that there was food there. Maybe it wasn't for people who came in, maybe refugees wouldn't be allowed to cross the border. So
I like what you're pointing out, Toby, because it also fits well with Jacob's two names, with Jacob and Israel, right? So it's not that he's a one-dimensional type of a person here, right? You know, there's multivalence there. He's a wrestler between these two, you know, personalities of his. It's very interesting to me too that he seems to be much more proactive outside of the land of Israel than he is once he's back in the land of Israel. And you get that sense that he's very, very timid in the land of Israel, you know, especially amongst, you know, Shechem, you know, what happens in the rape of Dinah. You know, Torah essentially rebukes him for his behavior, for his silence, for his passivity. You know, so we've got this tension of Reuven and Shimon, you know, taking vengeance, taking justice into their own hands, which is not good either. But there's this subtle or not so subtle critique of Jacob being silent and just saying, he doesn't want to make waves. He doesn't want to make trouble here, right? And that gets you into, different surahs if that's your mode. So, okay, let's go back into the source sheet. I want to go to this particular source about Jacob's brother Esav, right? Just before we get to chapter 37, in chapter 36, we're told that Esav took his wives, his sons and daughters, and all the members of his household, his cattle and all his livestock, and all the property that he had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to another land because of his brother Jacob. For their possessions were too many for them to dwell together, and the land where they sojourned could not support them because of their livestock. So Esav settled in the hill country of Seir, Esav being Edom. Okay, number one, this source should remind you of an earlier story in the book of Genesis. What story am I thinking of? One of our patriarchs ends up separating from a family member.
With Abraham and Lot, right? Did they?
Excellent. Okay. Abraham and Lot end up separating from each other after they come back from Egypt, because we're told that, right, they have so much wealth, the land cannot sustain them both. Okay. But it's Abraham that initiates that based on the fighting between their herdsmen. Okay. Here it's Esav who is so laden down with possessions that he decides that he just needs to go off to the hill country of Seir. Okay, and plant roots there and become a settled person. Look at what Ramban Nachmanides says on, in them but not in Esav, for Jacob alone will be called progeny, right? Again, that sense of temporality. Okay, and then Aviva Zorenberg, who writes in her book, The Beginning of Desire, such an artificial piece, a simulation of death and life, right? That is Jacob's desire to settle, can be expressed in terms of the storytelling model. Jacob seeks to order his experience, to construct his world in such a way that the texts of God's promise knit with his reality, each giving solid being to the other. Such a desire, as we have seen, may even represent the duty of a human being to seek out the meaningful structure of text and the world. And yet, this commendable passion for order becomes, in the metaphoric texture of Jacob's narrative, a temptation from which he is savagely barred. Just as he thinks he has arrived at a cogent version of his own narrative, trouble comes. Okay, now I'm ready for your comments and questions.
So Aviva, why use what, just so packed full in one small thought was one of the things I most enjoyed about, because it's one of the first things we studied together at JTS.
You probably even remember that passage.
I don't know. I remembered having a dictionary next to me when I read.
Right, yes.
Book.
Yeah. Other comments or questions on what we just read, Naomi?
Yes, I have a question. It seems to me that we knew that Esau was in Seir for a long time, because after the rapprochement, Esau went back to Seir, where he had come from, and Jacob decided, although he said, I will follow you later and meet you in Seir, he never went to meet up with Esau in Seir, and he began his whole journey, his sojourning wherever, to accumulate even greater wealth than he had at that time. So I don't know why they bring that up at this particular time. We knew Esau was in Seir.
Right, very good. Look, so one of the reasons that it's brought up is because there needs to be this parting of the ways, right? And remember from the very beginning, the way it is that Esav is described versus the way it is that Jacob is described. Esav is described as being Ish Yodeat Sa'id. He's the one that goes out on the hunt, right? The material world is very, very important to him. While on the other hand, Yaakov, right, the qualifier that we have for him is Yoshev Ohalim. He's the one that sits in the tents, right? And so essentially the way divine history is constructed at this point in Torah, it needs to lead to this this particular separation between the two, right? And then we have, as Shakespeare says, opposites juxtaposed one to another shine all the more. Where Jacob goes his way, he's unsettled, he's a navanad, he's a wanderer even in the chosen land, right? And Esav is there in Seir, right, acquiring even greater wealth. Diane.
I'm a little confused when you say, and Jacob was settled in a land that didn't belong to him. I understand that probably, we have to wait for after the Exodus kind of thing, I guess. I actually had never noticed that little passage because I've always thought that God promised it to us, but I actually don't know when it really became ours.
Right. So you're getting right to the essence here. This is a very, very important question for us and for our, relationship to the land itself, because even after, right, the Canaanites are no longer in the land, there's this sense that our connection to the land is a very, very fragile one, right? That even though, right, we're inhabitants of the land, right, we approach it with a sense of humility. Yes, we belong here, right? But there's the sense that our hold on the land is a tenuous one, right? And I believe that one of the reasons that Torah is teaching us that is because we need to be moral, ethical people committed to God's covenant. And if we are, right, if we are loyal, principle-centered, committed to the covenantal partnership, right, then that is part of what will ensure, right, our existence on this land, right? But if we stray, then, we potentially risk that. So I believe that's what Torah is saying in all of this. It's saying it about Jacob, and it also says it about us. Shelley?
So you discussed the fact that Jacob was working somewhat with an erroneous narrative. And then in relation to what that period of slavery was. But then you quoted Aviva Zornberg as talking about a narrative, and we all have our narratives. And it gives us reason to reflect about the assumptions that we make in life and how we move through our lives, as Jacob moved through his life on probably wrong assumptions. And it humbles you. It makes you realize, it makes you reflect more greatly on what those assumptions are about what you've made about yourself and what you've made as a people. And I love the way that she put it, because it makes us all have pause for, I don't know, doubt about these assumptions we make.
Right. I love how you're framing it in terms of, assumptions that we make, which leads me to say that, when we read the stories of Torah, we could read them in a very, very direct and intimate way, how they relate to our lives, right? But also we have to look at those stories with the lens of, right, how it relates to the arc of Jewish history, how it relates to, right, the big picture as well. And the challenge is, being able to find that balance. I think part of the critique here of Jacob is that he hasn't found that balance yet, right? But hopefully it's just around the corner. I want to go back into the story.
I think Joel had a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I'm sorry if I'm going back to, if the conversation had moved on and I'm going back to a previous concept about the land. I had to take a call. What had occurred to me, the thought had occurred to me when you were talking about being a steward of the land is, does anyone ever really own land? On this earth, does any people does any group really truly own the land that they're living on. Yes, if you start with English common law, you can purchase X amount of property and that's yours and you have certain rights to it, et cetera, et cetera. But all through history, since time immemorial, it does appear that there have been indigenous people in an area, and a stronger power came and said, okay, we're here now, this is ours. Whether this is in the Middle East, whether it's in North America, Australia, New Zealand, wherever it is. And having said that, it really does seem to be mainly in the English-speaking world where a lot of this has happened. But I mean, if this is the nature of human behavior, then the corollary to that would be we need to be careful stewards of what we are currently, as you say, we have to be very humble about what we are doing here, not arrogant. This is ours, this is always ours, always has been, always will be. That's one attitude, may not get you too far, but we need to be very careful stewards of this property which we currently are residing on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I love that, Joel. And you can even go to the whole concept of Shemitah, how it reinforces what you just said, right? To have a Shnat Shabbaton, right? The sabbatical year and the release of the land. The whole point behind that is showing that you really don't own this land, right? Who is the owner of the land? The owner of the land is God, right? This is God's possession. This is not our possession. So, I think it's very, very powerful that Torah is conveying this particular lesson. That Torah is, a particular book of the Jewish people, but there's also, a universal sense to what is being taught here. And the fact that it's trying to inculcate a sense of humility in each and every one of us is vital. Linda Fain. Take yourself off mute.
It seems like that's a story that we keep repeating over and over through our history, that we need to understand that we're not tied to the land and that we shouldn't be so comfortable where we are. It's a tenuous way to live, but it seems like every time we forget it, something comes up to remind us.
Right. Certainly, it's one of the lessons of Jewish history, in Galut, and I think it's an important lesson for us to grasp here in Israel. Steve,
I mean, it's part of a larger notion that all of our possessions are really temporal. The land, of course, also, but even everything. That we all know the sayings. What do you take with you? What do you leave behind? Really. So it kind of dovetails to that same notion, I think.
Right. Very well said. Okay, let's go back into the Jacob Joseph story. I want to get to Joseph. And here we are. Okay, so immediately after our first verse, this is what we read. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended to the flocks with his brother as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all of his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. Once Joseph had a dream, which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, right? You get the picture, right? Joseph is very, very self-centered. He sparks the enmity of his brothers. Look at what Rashi has to say about Joseph. Okay, and this is based on the word na'ar that appears in this passage that we just read, where it says, V'hu nar et b'nei Bilhah ve'et b'nei Zilpah. Okay, na'ar is a word that speaks to a sense of youth. So Rashi jumps off on that and says, Shehaya oseh ma'aseh na'arut, mitaken b'se'aro, mimashmesh be'enav, kedei sheyeh nireh yafeh. His actions were childish. He dressed his hair, he touched up his eyes so that he should appear good looking, right? All of this to say that he was quite a self-absorbed person, right? He was very, very much into, right, his, now, of course, remember that we're dealing with a 17-year-old here, okay? But still we find it quite striking, okay? And it's important to hold this image of Joseph that we have at the beginning of the story, because that image is going to change gradually between this chapter, chapter 37, by the time we get to the end of the book of Genesis. You're going to see this radical transformation in Joseph, okay? Step by step, he's going to mature, right? And Joseph himself is going to bring God into the picture, okay? I'm going to jump to that point where Joseph begins to have this recognition of God's presence, okay? Source number 13 here. Joseph is in the house of Potiphar. We all know what happens with Potiphar's wife, how she tries to seduce Joseph when her husband is out of the house. And we're told here, but he refused, that is, Joseph refused Potiphar's wife's advances. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives not thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then can I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" Okay, so this is the first mention that we have, right? Joseph is acknowledging, apart from what would be a sin against the master of the house, Potiphar, right? The greater sin, right, would be against God here, against the principles that will firmly root this ancestor of ours, right? And then once again, when he finds himself in jail as a result of the intrigues in Potiphar's house, and he interprets the dream of the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, right? Listen to what he says. When they had been in custody for some time, both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of Egypt, they were confined in prison, dreamed in the same night, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were distraught. He asked Pharaoh's courtiers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you appear downcast today?" They said to him, "We had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." So Joseph said to them, "Surely God can interpret. Tell me your dreams." Okay, so even here, right, we see these steps that Joseph takes toward being a more mature individual, toward bringing God into his story, bringing God into his life, recognizing the presence of God where God is seemingly absent here. Right, but Joseph is beginning to see those divine fingerprints in his life. Linda, I just saw your hand go up.
I see him as being still very self-centered, though, that, surely God can interpret, tell me your dreams. So he is now the interpreter for God. That's a very strong position to take.
Look, it could be understood either way, right? Either this could be self-aggrandizement that we're talking about here, which would certainly inflate his sense of self-importance, right? Or, right, the fact that he's acknowledging that this special power that he has comes from God, right? That, so one could also say that it's expressing humility on his part, that, don't think that I am the source of the answer to this dream or these dreams, right? But rather it's coming from another place. It's not me.
Stephen?
I'm just going to add on in that first word there, by my aim, where he's kind of resisting Potiphar's wife's, come on to him. The Hebrew and the trope on there is very interesting. This trope, shalshelet, I think it's only in the whole Torah 5 times, and one of them's on that word, and it's up and down. shut me in shame, and he's going, it's like he has a struggle within him. Should I do this? Should I not? Should I? Because back and forth, and then he ends up, yes, that could be the transition point right there, where he makes that move over to the other side.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I love that you're pointing that out.
I chanted it before.
There you go. Diane.
A quick question, nothing to do with Joseph, really. I noticed in the very first thing you read, they used the word Israel, because remember, Yaakov, but is this part of what you're talking about, the dual, because sometimes it's referred to as Yaakov and sometimes Israel. Is this the first time we see that, or no?
Yes, exactly. He goes, well, Torah goes back and forth between Jacob and Israel, right? So
we see two personalities then? We should look for that?
Yes, definitely. I believe that's clearly part of what is happening here. Sometimes Jacob is able to be his new self, right? That he acquired in the wrestling match with the mysterious assailant, and sometimes he falls back into his old ways, right? And yeah,
I didn't know that before.
No, I'm glad your eyes went right to that. Okay, so I know we're nearing the finish line. I want to wrap up with a source that does not appear on your source sheet. Nonetheless, it's a very, very beautiful Dvar Torah that I want to share with you. And this comes from Rabbi Avram Isaac Cook. It's a commentary related to this whole business of Joseph bringing back bad reports about his brothers, right? He would tattletale on his brothers to their father, right? So in the very liminal moment in the story when Jacob turns to Joseph and says, I want you to go out and check on your brothers and see how they're doing, right? Ultimately, this ends up becoming a trap, right? He goes out to his brothers, and that's when all the misery begins. The brothers see him coming from afar, throw him into a pit. Okay, so take a look at what Rav Kook has to say here. I love this. Okay. Rav Kook's commentary is on these words. Lech na re'eh et shlom achecha. Okay, go please and check on the welfare of your brothers. Rav Kook writes the following. Every person has their positive and negative qualities. Who says that when one looks at an individual, they should only dwell on their negative attributes? Right? Remember, that's what Joseph does because he brings back these negative reports. Just as there is no human being without weaknesses, so too there is no human being without strengths. We are commanded to see and experience a person in all of his or her fullness and not to simply focus on their negative side. This is precisely what Jacob commanded in response to Joseph bearing negative reports about his brothers. Jacob responded by commanding Joseph, go, please check on the welfare of your brothers. Joseph, who was acutely aware of the shortcomings of his brothers, is now commanded by his father to see them in a new light, to see them in their fullness. Part of what you need to understand is that Rav Kook is latching onto the word shalom, but an alternative meaning. Shalom, we know, means peace, right? The modern Hebrew expression, ma shalomcha, right? How are you doing? But Rav Kook is going deeper. He sees the root shalem, which means complete, or shleimut, completeness. And so when he reads the verse, he says, Lech na re'eh et shleimut achecha. Go out and see the wholeness of your brothers. See the big picture. Don't just dwell on the negativity, right? And I love that. That, here we are talking about bringing God's presence into our midst. And I think one of the most powerful ways that we can bring God's presence into our midst is to be dan l'kaf zchut, is to give people in our lives the benefit of the doubt, right? Do what we can to see the positives. There's a great verse in the book of Psalms that says, Urei betuv Yerushalayim, right? Look for the goodness in Jerusalem. I think all too often we could be very, very critical of what we see here in our country. And
Especially
Tehillim, the book.
especially if you read the newspapers too much.
That's right, Steve. Right. And right, sometimes we got to pause, just like what Rav Kook is teaching and just like what Psalms is teaching us, right? Urei betuv Yerushalayim, right? Go out and see goodness. See the goodness in Jerusalem. See the goodness in our family. See the goodness in our community. There's plenty of goodness that we're surrounded by. So with that, I want to wish you all Chag Urim Sameach, a happy and healthy Hanukkah. Go out and bring some light into this world. Carolyn.
Amen. Yasher Koach, thank you, Rabbi.
That was great.
Thank you to all of you for your support and your participation of this class. This has really become the highlight of our week, and I hope yours too. I want to bring your attention to a couple more learning opportunities next week. Monday's Lunch and Learn for JTS is going to feature Professor Yoni Brofman, who's an assistant professor of Jewish thought and ethics. That's at 1 o'clock class. It's been a really wonderful experience. If you don't have the information, I'd be happy to send it to you. And next Thursday, we'll be a little tighter on our time. We'll have to stick to the hour format for sure, because Rabbi will be teaching another class at 10 a.m. If you haven't received the email, I'll send it again, about the seventh day of light, a wonderful opportunity to learn from 5 JTS teachers. They'll be teaching throughout the day, and it's an opportunity to make your gift to JTS if you haven't done so already. Please do, and if you have, we thank you most sincerely. We're back here again next week, Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you for being with us.
Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. Be well.
Sameach.